I've been going back and forth a lot between using the ROG Ally and the Steam Deck as my main PC handheld, trying out the same games, trying out some games that one can play the other can't, and just getting the full experience of what it's like to really lean into using one of these devices. And I feel ready to share some of my main thoughts in terms of the differences between them. Some of these differences are obvious, others I think are maybe a bit more subtle or just aren't the things you might think about right out the gate. Now, while this video is primarily focused on comparing these two because they are, I think, much more direct competitors in a sense, I do also want to talk about the Nintendo Switch a little bit, especially because when put in a lineup between that, the Steam Deck, and the Ally, there's a very interesting kind of sliding gradient of what the goal for each device is and how it handles that. Also worth noting, for full disclosure, this Asus ROG Ally is one that was sent to me for free by both Asus and Xbox for review purposes, so thanks to them for sending that out. The Steam Deck and the Switches I talk about were bought and paid for by us. I also want to shout out, this is the second ROG Ally video that I've done. The previous one was more of a 30-day recap of my experiences with it, things that I really like about it, and things I don't like about it. So make sure to check out that video as well for some more full coverage on it. I am planning more stuff on this and other PC handhelds as they begin to drop, because that is clearly a growing industry. So if you don't want to miss out on that stuff, make sure to subscribe. One thing to clarify too when talking about my comparison between these, both of these systems do have multiple model revisions. The Steam Deck model variations are a little more subtle. The biggest thing really is storage size, and then for the highest version of the system you do get an anti-glare screen. This is the mid-spec one, so I don't have that better screen, but I do have more storage than the baseline Steam Deck offers, whereas the ROG Ally does come in two fairly different spec options in terms of power. This is the higher end model, so this is really looking at what the most expensive, most powerful version of this model has to offer compared to the mainline Steam Deck. Now, let's talk differences between these two. Before we get into performance aspects of both systems, the first thing I really want to touch on is the physical design of them, just the comfortability of using them as handheld gaming systems. And this is one area where I do think overall the Steam Deck does come out ahead. Something I appreciate about the ROG Ally in comparison is that it does have what I would consider to be a more traditional button and stick layout. It is using an offset design similar to what you would see on an Xbox controller, but there's that sense of higher lower placement that you have with the D-pad and stick on the left, A, B, X, Y buttons and stick on the right, whereas the Steam Deck goes for a slightly more original approach with a symmetrical layout where the sticks, D-pad, and A, B, X, Y buttons are all shoved to the top of the control unit, so there's space to fit those touchpads that I personally don't find a lot of uses for. There are some very specific games where they can come in handy, and I know some people personally love to use them a lot. I don't really use them a whole lot, but I have gotten used to the feeling of having all the buttons and sticks up high. Where the Steam Deck really comes out ahead when it comes to the comfort of using the system is the hand grip design. The ROG Ally, when you look at it, it's not a perfectly flat back, but the curvature for the hand grips isn't very large. Your preference on this might vary a little bit with your particular hand size and shape, but I've just felt that when using it for a long period of time where there is a place for your hands to rest on it, it does end up getting a little bit uncomfortable over time, not nearly as bad as the Switch where you just have that flat body and you basically have to buy a grip or large Joy-Cons. But the Steam Deck by comparison has these much more pronounced grip shapes that when playing for a very long period of time, I find to be a lot more comfortable. I think it's also worth noting that as far as long-term playability and comfort goes, because of the performance profiles and the hardware inside of them, the ROG Ally does end up running a lot hotter by comparison, and that is a heat that you can feel. I have had moments where when playing laying down, I set the system down for a little bit and I just go, oh, that's kind of toasty. The Steam Deck, while it certainly can get warm, doesn't really hit the same level. Now, part of that is because, again, the ROG Ally is a higher spec system, and we're going to talk about some of the important differences there. But I do think that in terms of just the comfort of using these systems in handheld mode often, that is something that's a bit of a surprising note to point out. While talking physical build, and in particular the heat production, one other thing worth calling attention to with the ROG Ally right now is the issues people have been having with the micro SD card slots. This is the easiest method of expanding the storage of the system. You can use the internal storage for games, but if you want to add more games without actually opening and modifying the system up, you can use the expandable SD card to install more titles. And as of right now, these launch versions of the Ally have been running into problems with how much the high heat levels can mess with that reader. In particular, making it very difficult to remove the SD card if you ever want to, and have problems with reading it. This is something that Asus has acknowledged, and they are planning on having updates for the system that help better manage the production of the system to prevent issues like that from cropping up. But ultimately, it is a problem the system is currently experiencing and is important to be aware of. Now, while the body shape and design of the Steam Deck I think gives it an advantage when it comes to long-term handheld gaming, the ROG Ally definitely wins out a little bit more when it comes to the quality of the gameplay experience it's transferring over. Not even talking about performance yet, we'll get to that in a moment, but looking at the display that's built in and the speakers on the system. The speakers in the ROG Ally are considerably louder than the ones on the Steam Deck. It can get very loud, almost surprisingly so, when you really crank it up as high as it can go. I have noticed occasionally there seems to be some kind of driver issue where on occasion there is this kind of popping staticky sound that comes out of them though, that can be a little worrying. When that has happened, I've been able to get rid of it just by restarting the system, and this plays into one of the things about the ROG Ally that bothers me a lot. We'll talk about it a little later. But when those speakers are working properly, they sound wonderful. As for the display, one of the really important things to point out right away is the fact that it is a higher resolution than the one on the Steam Deck. The Steam Deck is a 16:10 aspect ratio at 800p, whereas the ROG Ally is a 16:9 aspect ratio that is 1080p. I will say that for a lot of games, especially higher end, more demanding ones, I tend to drop down the display resolution to 720 anyways, just to preserve having a better frame rate, so they can be a little closer visually there. But for those games where you can choose to boost the resolution all the way to 1080p natively, there is definitely a difference in crispness for those. A good example of this would be Hades, a game that's a little demanding, but not nearly as much as some major games. And when you compare playing it on 800p here versus 1080p on here, the 800p is certainly enough to get a good looking gameplay experience, but there is that extra little level you're getting on the 1080p here. I would also say that the general quality of the display for the ROG Ally is a little better for other aspects of visuals as well. For instance, color. I don't think the Steam Deck looks bad by any means, and honestly, some of these differences are the kind where if you're not looking at them directly side by side, you're not going to be like, oh wow, this one looks so much better. But when compared side by side with certain titles, for instance Hades once again, you are seeing a bit more vibrancy and color on the ROG Ally display versus the Steam Decks. Now, as for how these systems actually run their games and the OSs that they're employing, and this is where the Switch comes up a little bit, because I think the Steam Deck is a very interesting system in terms of being kind of a middle option for how to handle these things. The Switch is a very traditional handheld that relies on playing its own library of games that are designed specifically for it, and it is meant to be a gaming handheld first and foremost. The ROG Ally, on the other hand, is a true handheld PC. It is running Windows, it is a traditional PC as far as the UI interface and everything goes, and when using it docked, it effectively feels like you're just using a PC. Whereas the Steam Deck takes this middle approach where, yes, it is a PC handheld, but it is running its own built-in OS with SteamOS that plays a more limited number of games because it's only playing stuff from your Steam library, and even then there are titles that are not available because they're not considered optimized for the system or make use of certain copyright protection stuff that the system just doesn't deal with at all. This rules out a lot of multiplayer games and some MMOs. But as a result, it also offers an experience that feels much more like a traditional gaming handheld. A little more complex than that of the Switch, but ultimately an experience that, especially now after having been out for over a year and getting lots of updates over time, really feels like a very user-friendly experience that you're not always going to get on something that is effectively just like using a PC. There's a lot of additional freedoms and things you can do with the ROG Ally because it is just operating like a Windows PC, but there are additional frustrations and strange things that happen with it too as a result. For instance, something that I mentioned back in my love-hate the ROG Ally video, the first time I set up and launched the Ally, it actually didn't install the ASUS stuff correctly, and so a lot of its hotkeys and buttons and features didn't actually work, and I had to fully reset the system doing a fresh install, after which it was fine. But I think that's a really good indicative example of things that can happen with the Ally. It is entirely possible that you could pick one of these up and end up just having a smooth experience, but there are lots of times where this can play anything that's effectively available on Windows. Things aren't always going to work out quite as smoothly as something that's using a UI and OS specifically meant for handheld, because ultimately the Windows operating system isn't really meant to be used in a handheld system. And ASUS's program Armory Crate SE helps fill a lot of this gap and does make it feel more natural in a handheld setting, but you're just going to run into these weird compatibility issues here and there that are going to remind you that, yeah, this works like a handheld, but there's just kind of be weird stuff that happens here and there. Now, in exchange for these potential headaches is the fact that the Ally is running Windows and thus has a much broader amount of compatibility with way more games than the Steam Deck does out of the box. You could potentially install the Windows OS on Steam Deck and have it reach that same kind of compatibility, but it's not really the intended purpose of the Steam Deck, and I would say that at this point, with more Windows handhelds like this coming out, if your goal is that you want something that runs Windows, you should just look at something that's meant to do that out of the box. Whereas with Steam Deck, Embrace the fact that you are buying this for SteamOS and is being used specifically for your Steam library. The limitation of this is that some games natively aren't really meant to be ran on the system. If you want to play something that is not available on the Steam library, you can't do that on the Steam Deck, at least normally. With the Ally, if you want to run Diablo 4 using Battle.net, you can do that. And really, if you just want to do anything that you could traditionally do on a PC, those are things that you can find ways to make use of on Steam Deck, but are much more straightforward on the Ally, especially if you're already used to using a Windows PC. It's actually one of the really interesting things about the differences in the docked experiences between these systems. When you dock the Ally, it feels like you're just using a PC. If you're using it in a docked setup that is a desktop mode, using a keyboard and mouse, you're using a Windows PC. When you're using the Steam Deck, while you can do a keyboard and mouse setup with that, it actually feels more natural to use a controller. Something that, again, brings it a little more in line with the experience of using a traditional gaming handheld like the Nintendo Switch, whereas the ROG Ally really leans into, this is effectively a PC, but we have shoved it into a handheld body. Now, another benefit of this is that along with running Windows, the ROG Ally is also just a higher spec device compared to the Steam Deck. A more expensive one as well, though not by a crazy margin considering the boost in power that it offers. But when it comes to getting the absolute most out of some games, especially bigger AAA ones, you're going to get smoother, better experiences on the Ally because of its higher specs. For example, one game that I've been playing a lot lately is Baldur's Gate 3, and running it on both systems, the Steam Deck is able to run it in a manageable way. You do have to drop the settings down a little bit. You can keep it at the 800p resolution, but you're not going to have graphics settings at their highest, and you're able to maintain a frame rate that hugs close to 30, but isn't exactly constantly consistent, which, to be fair, the game's frame rate isn't always the most consistent, even on higher power PCs. Whereas with the ROG Ally, you can have it running at 1080p or even drop it down to 720 if you want to exchange for a higher frame rate, boost the graphics settings more so, and get a frame rate that is much more stable and above 30, at least when you're running the system in its highest performance profile. The downside of this is how much you care about a handheld being, well, a truly unplugged handheld. Some of the experiences swapping between these almost remind me a little bit of the old days of Game Boy versus Game Gear, where the Game Boy was a clearly less powerful system in terms of the visuals that it was pumping out. It didn't even have color at the time initially, but you were able to play it for a long period of time unplugged from anything using batteries. Whereas the Game Gear, you could use batteries, but it was going to tear through those really fast, and ultimately, if you wanted to play for long periods of time, it really worked out better just to hang out nearby a wall outlet and have it plugged into power. And that's exactly the kind of dynamic that I've been feeling using these two systems. The ROG Ally is a more powerful system that's going to give you better performance and is going to better run a lot of more demanding games, but it doesn't really have the strongest battery life out there, especially in those situations. You know, especially when we're looking at things like major AAA games, if you're looking to spend a number of hours back-to-back playing them and you don't necessarily want to just pop into a quick match and pop back out, the battery life on this is not really going to support that kind of playstyle, and instead you're much better off plugging it into a nearby wall outlet. Whereas the Steam Deck, while it's not pushing nearly as much power for performance, it's also conserving a lot more energy when playing stuff, even when you're doing things like running more demanding games with lower graphic settings and using FSR to help cover some of the gap in performance. The games aren't looking as great and not running quite as smoothly, but the Steam Deck is going to be able to do that for a longer period of time. And to be honest, neither of them really hits the kind of full battery life that I would love to have in a handheld, but the Steam Deck absolutely gets a lot closer. One other note for the docked experience that is not something we can really test out right now. One of the interesting features of the ROG Ally is that it is also planning on supporting external GPUs using ASUS's own proprietary connection design. So down the line, if you wanted to have something like a PC handheld that then offered a more powerful docked experience when you hooked it up to a desktop setup, the ROG Ally is going to be able to leverage that with that external GPU support, which is not something the Steam Deck can do with its current port setup. That does also come with the increased cost of having to buy an eGPU on top of everything else, but it is worth being aware that it is something the system can eventually make use of if you've got the money to burn for it. In many ways, I think one of the best ways to really highlight the differences between these two and what might be a better fit for you is ultimately what kind of games you're looking to play on the go and how you want your UI experience to be on a handheld. If you want something that feels more like a traditional gaming handheld where it has its own baked-in OS, it is built for controller style input primarily in mind, it has better battery life, better usability on the go, and is something more comfortable to hold in your hands for a long period of time, the Steam Deck is a great way to go. But if you want power and a larger list of compatible games, whether that's playing stuff on other launchers, accessing Game Pass games through Xbox, the ROG Ally is absolutely the stronger, albeit possibly more headache-filled experience. I honestly really don't think there's a clear winner here when it comes comes to which one is absolutely better. I mean, if you just want to talk about raw performance, yes, sure, the Ally is stronger. But I think the Steam Deck makes a very strong argument for the benefits of a focused OS that is meant for this form factor and more traditional gaming handheld experience. That said, if what I've talked about for either of these makes you any more or less interested in them, I do have links posted down below in the description for both the Steam Deck and the ROG Ally. As always, if you enjoyed this video, hit the thumbs up button to let me know, subscribe if you haven't yet, and I will see you guys later.